Okay, welcome everyone. Today so in the last few lectures with Peter and Vinay, they kind of went through sort of a large scale overview of like a lot of fMRI and a lot of MRI physics. For this talk, it's also going to be a bit of an overview talk where I'm going to try and go through, you actually want to go collect data, you actually want to run a study. What are the parts of the study from design to interpretation? And I welcome questions in person, so please interrupt as we go. I'll prod people if I'm not getting enough interruptions. And maybe can one of the people here log on remotely just to keep an eye if there's questions. Thank you, Kevin. Okay, so basic fMRI study. Have an MRI machine. You throw some people in the machine. You get applications, fame, money, change. Okay, done. I'm obviously joking a little bit here, but if you sort of go to the earlier years of fMRI, there's a whole bunch of studies I like to call the neural growth studies, which is, oh, we're interested in learning about driving. We're going to, throw someone in the driving simulator and say the neural growth of driving is our publication. We want to study working memory. We're going to throw someone in neural growth of working memory, the title of their paper. So there's a whole series of papers that are just neural growth. So we have a task, we've done it, throw MRI, collect data, and we're done. And I'll note that I'm sort of poking at this. Some of these studies are phenomenal studies. Some of these studies are less than phenomenal. But I think it's sort of framed that early on, a lot of people felt like, we had cognitive science, we had, had technology, just throw people in a scanner, and that's a lot of what's done. But you can see like these still aren't actually done yet. So there's still, neural correlates papers in the title still going on. Let's shut that up again. Okay, that's really good. For the online and recorded people, display of that's fascinating. No, it's not okay. Let me see if I can do this.
Sure.
Oh my God. Okay, so the window of who's on talk disappears when I don't have my slides visible here. So that's a little bit annoying. So if I go back here, they reappear and I touched it. That is really frustrating. And now I can't move slides back and forth. I'm a little bit frustrating. Let me quickly go to this. I am sharing that desktop. I don't know. That is for the online people. The window of the video seems to be popping up in the middle of the slides. Oh, there I got it. So let me see. That works. Okay. And yeah, tell me if that comes up again. So as I was saying that, these papers still exist. So goals of this talk overall. I can't obviously cover everything. It's a bit of an overview talk. If we finish this talk and you kind of learn the key phases of study design, of fMRI study design analysis, understand the types of decisions we make each step, and ideally know when to ask for help, because you're not going to know the answers to everything. No one really knows the answers to every type of question, but knowing what you don't know and knowing to ask for help, I think, is a huge step in moving studies forward. What I'm not going to do in this talk is the best options for every type of study or explain every type of fMRI analysis and method. So I'm going to do a bit of a sampling, a bit of a graphic, and hopefully it comes together with some useful information. Like I said, I cannot cover all fMRI studies. Just to give you a hint of like huge categories of like types of studies. I think that the classic early studies that are still, really robust centerpiece of the field, or what I call task fMRI, where each voxel at a time, we have some tasks, we fit each voxel to some sort of task model. You can have multivariate pattern analysis, where you're sort of taking a bunch of voxels in time series and looking at the relationships between the signal across time. You can have still task fMRI, but when you get to much smaller resolution, like sub 1 millimeter, sometimes called mesoscopic, it adds up a whole bunch of other issues on how you analyze and think about the data. You can do correlation studies where you're comparing relationships between time series at different points of the brain. You can do combinations of these together where you're looking at whole brain connectivity measures in relationship to task. And you can do things like comparing movies, comparing, have people watch the same movie and look at how the time series are similar across people. So there's a wide range of fMRI studies. I'll sample a little bit here and there. There's no way I'm even doing a surface description of all of these just in one talk. So the real basic fMRI study. I'm going to divide this into 5 parts, which will be roughly the way I'm going to go through the rest of this talk. So first section is what I'll call scientific questions and study design. So what are you doing? What types of tasks you're doing? And what are you collecting? Then piloting, which is figuring things out that you want to collect and optimizing things. Then setting up your data collection protocol, so figuring out how you're actually going to run your study. Then data collection. Then data analysis and interpretation. And finally, communication. One thing I'll stress in this overview slide is, as I show here, piloting and data collection is sort of an iterative process back and forth, and the protocol. So you sort of pilot something, you say, how is that going to inform how we're going to collect our full study? And you might test it back and forth a few times. And the other important thing I want to add here is quality assurance, which is at multiple steps of this process. You have your questions, you have the things you want to know. But are you actually getting that? So pretty much at every step of this process, you should be looking at, am I seeing what I expect to see, following basic ideas, basic results. So this is an fMRI study and you're collecting the data. There's a whole other growing role of fMRI studies where we're using online shared data. And I will tweak this to better represent that. So this is a basic fMRI with existing data. You've still got to form your question. The question why the data exists, but why do you want to analyze it? What are you trying to get from it is the same. Instead of piloting, the data is already been collected. So you want to decide how you're processing it and defining your protocol based on your question. And you're identifying your shared data. The very major thing I want to assess and emphasize here is quality assurance is important when you're collecting your own data. It is essential when you are using data off the that was collected somewhere else, because every single data set has issues, and you either ideally the person who shared the data is going to tell you what the issues are, but they might not know some of the issues. If you're doing novel with it, they might not know the issues that are with your data. So you really have to look at the data, understand it, and assume that there's things you're going to find that you didn't expect. I'll also note that I think on July 28th, I'm going to give us another talk on this very specifically on quality assurance. But it is absolutely critical for this. So before I launch into sort of details into these steps and overall questions so far. Okay. So I'm starting out with scientific questions and studies on that first group. And beyond, what is your question? A key question thing is, what are you actually going to collect? So what is the question? Why are you doing the study? What is your goal from it? And once you have your scientific question, what types of data can accurately and effectively answer your scientific question? And this feels obvious to say, but so many studies get caught up at this exact phase, like, making sure that you have a clear question and the data you're collecting is good to answer that question. So I wanted to start there. And then, what types of data are we talking about? From the MRI side, do you collect tasks where, the person is in the scanner looking or hearing at something and performing some sort of button press along the way? Do you have them do something a bit more passive, like watch a movie? Or do you have them do something completely passive, which is, you know, sit in the scanner and rest, which pretty much means have them sit in the scanner with unconstrained behavior. So they're sitting in there thinking about whatever they want. Maybe you'll have them keep their eyes open, their closed, but beyond that, it's just having them sit in the scanner. And these are different styles of studies that have different benefits and weaknesses. But it all comes back to what's the question you're trying to answer. And then beyond the functional MRI, there's what other scans you get. So very often with fMRI, we're going to collect at least a high resolution brain anatomy scan, which we sometimes call a structural scan. You can also get other MRI scans that are tuned to different things like fusion tractography, or scans that are, you know, tuned to the vascular structure or other aspects. And even for fMRI, we want to do a calibration measure, something that might account for some variation you see across cycle populations. And there's also the non-MRI measures. So do you want to collect pulse, respiration, simultaneous electro EEG, eye tracking? You know, what types of participant responses do you want to collect during the scan? I can't go through all of these in detail, but the one I want to sort of focus on right now is this peripheral measures of respiration and pulse. Mostly because it's something that, at least at NIH, it's really easy to collect, and it's fairly easy to collect everywhere, pulse and respiration, but it's strangely not done as often as it should. It should be a default, and it's not. And here's my cautionary tale of why you should do this. So this is from back when I was getting my PhD. I have this nice published study. It was comparing young and old populations with the visual tests and a breath-hold task, trying to see, you know, are there differences in the fMRI response shape in young or old or across different brain regions. Probably study or read it. But the main thing to take out from here is in the published paper, I was showing these flashing checkerboards that flashed in the screen for about 200 milliseconds. So, you know, 200 milliseconds, wait 18 to 24 seconds, another one. That was only part of the data I collected. The unpublished part of the study is I was also trying to see how the fMRI response changed with different durations stimuli. So instead of 200 milliseconds, what happens with 3, 6, and 12-second stimuli. The trouble is, as I was collecting this data and I was recording the respiration, a non-trivial number of the volunteers were holding their breath whenever the checkerboard appeared on the screen. So you show a flashing checkerboard for 3 seconds, they hold their breath for 3 seconds. You show a checkerboard for 6 seconds, they hold their breath for 6 seconds. This is not uncommon. People do this. People do this frequently. If you have a task, and this is a boring task, if you have a task that's intense and requires like thought, people will kind of skip a few breaths while they are doing their tasks. And the reason this is an issue is breath holding causes a robust brain-wide fMRI response. What that means, if I didn't collect respiration data, I would have had really visually appealing results because I would have gotten this robust response in all my regions of interest. It would be great, it would be clear, and it would be completely misinterpreted because I'd been looking at the effect of breath holding, not the stimulus. And the only reason this is unpublished because essentially I went into it with one plan and the data was not what I thought it was. So, you know, this trial journal with no effect, this is different. This was essentially, I did not get the data I expected. I was doing a breath holding task when I wanted to do a checkerboard task. So this part was unpublished. And the only thing that prevented this from being published and wrong was the fact that I bothered to collect respiration data and look at it. Any questions so far? Okay. So still going on this area of scientific questions and study design. There's sort of these bigger study level questions. Besides, so the stuff before an acquisition was like, you know, what do you collect per person? What are study level questions? How many subjects do you get? And how much data per subject? And there's some things out there that sort of say like, this is the right way to think about it, this is the right way. But a lot of it comes down to, again, what were your initial questions? Are you looking for effects in an individual person? So do you want to say, like, I have a behavior measure that I see vary across people, and I want to be able to get a robust fMRI measure related to this behavior in every individual? That would skew towards getting more and more individual subject data. Are you looking for a group effect? Then maybe your individual data could be a bit noisier, but you're going to get a lot more subjects in each group, so you can really compare. Are you looking for this behavioral fMRI response variation across participants? Then you really do need enough subject in each individual that you're confident that your behavioral fMRI relationship is at least clean enough to get good results. If you're looking for a diagnostic or treatment relevant marker, then your individual data has to be extremely high quality. And these are sort of overall questions. One way people think about some of these questions, especially on sample size, is through power analyses. And power analyses are important. There's a bunch of tools out there to try and do an estimate on fMRI power. This is a fairly recent paper by Hashier, which is essentially taking a bunch of large data sets and looking at connectivity and task measures and trying to give you sort of an online way to model, if this is the effect size you're looking for, how many subjects do I need? What's the essentially effect size and noise variation we're going to be getting? Right, so sort of help you calculate your needed sample size. There are other studies like this one, which are again looking at brain-wide association studies, which are sort of doing this contour map of how many subjects you need versus how long to scan for each subject. So the longer you scan for each subject, the more stable your individual data is. So the more likely you need less overall subjects. So it's a relationship back and forth. And there's a lot more out there. These are sort of just two that I felt worth mentioning. The big thing I want to emphasize here is power analyses, like I said, are important, but they can be overemphasized and oversimplified. fMRI is a noisy data. Everything you do to make your data less noisy is going to give you better results. So just saying, if you're acquiring too noisy data, maybe you need 50 subjects or 100 subjects or 200 subjects, but saying I can improve the data quality by X% and now I'm confident I need 30 subjects is going to be much more bang for your buck than sort of using these power analysis tools that inherently are making some sort of semi-arbitrary assumptions about what your effect size is and what your noise level is. So you have to measure that for your study and for your contrast. And only then can you really sort of figure out the relationship between the data you're planning to collect and the expected sample size. Any questions on this one? Today.
Oh,
yeah.
So maybe the production techniques, like for example, you came up with let's say a connectivity analysis, you have a data production techniques that can substantially improve your statistical power. That would also benefit, right?
Okay. Yeah, just for the mic here, the question is, can data reduction techniques also significantly improve things? I think yes. So I think another way of phrasing that is, in the end, power is what our effect is and how we measure our effect. So anything that is more tuned to the effect you care about is going to effectively increase your effect size and reduce your sample size. So as sort of a general example, let's say you're looking at correlations between time series, like a connectivity analysis, and you're looking at individual correlations between two voxels. That's going to be a really noisy measure. But if you're doing something that sort of says, we know there's a spatial pattern, and we're looking at the relationship between these patterns, and now you're sort of making a pattern averaged over 50 data points in the subject, that's going to be a more stable measure, which is going to give you a more stable effect versus effect size versus noise measure, which reduces your sample size. So everything from how we acquire data to how we analyze data can affect your sample size.
Sure.
So the next couple slides, I'm going to be focusing on how to think about fMRI acquisition parameters specifically, with some general stuff and then just a few specific examples. If there's any take-home message to get from this section, it's there is no universally best parameters for an fMRI study. And if there's a take-home message number 2 is never copy parameters from another study without understanding why they made their choices. Anyone who sort of works on the service side of fMRI, of like people coming by, they're like, someone comes in and says, my data looks bad, what's wrong with it? And you look at it and you say, oh, the area you're interested in isn't visible on your scans. Where did you get those parameters from? And again, because I copied it from someone else. And it turns out whoever they copied it from wasn't interested in the area they are interested in. So it's very often, we almost all do is we copy parameters from someone else, but then you have to think about them and understand them. And just copying it blindly very frequently leads to things you regret later. So as you're thinking of acquisition parameters, again, we're going back to that study design. What are the questions you have? What matters? There is brain coverage and dropout. So dropout is, I don't know if Peter talked about this in the earlier lecture. Dropout is there's areas of the brain which have a bit more distortion when you conduct standard fMRI, and we just sort of, the brain's there, but we lose the fMRI cell there. So there's different ways to address those dropout. Often the front, orbital frontal area, sometimes by the auditory, by the ears, we get some dropout areas. So if those areas are really important to you, then you're going to really want to tune your study to retain as much of those areas as possible. And here's just a picture on the side of this was a study where they were really interested in the inferior like this. And that's a really hard area to image. So it's important if you're interested in an area like this to make sure not only that it's in your imaging brain, you're covered by your brain volume, but you actually get reliable data there. There's, going back to copying parameters, there's a whole bunch of studies out there that, don't really think the cerebellum is part of the brain. And if you have a scientific question and it doesn't involve the cerebellum, you might have scanned, less coverage, improved other things, you go to the cerebellum. And then someone else copies your parameters, and it turns out they actually cared about the cerebellum and didn't realize they weren't reliably getting it. So what areas of the brain do you care about for your study? Every fMRI scan has distortion. So that distortion is essentially you have, there's what your brain actually looks like, and there's what the images look, are collected as. So very often things can be, shifted to the left or the right, or warped up and down, depending on what you're doing, or warped in sort of less controlled ways. So if you collect the data, most of the brain is relatively undistorted, but there's almost always going to be some areas that are, especially near the dropout regions, they're going to have spatial distortion too. And again, if you care about those locations, if you care about localizing those regions, you might want to optimize against that distortion. And then two other things that I'll show in some neighboring slides are temporal signal to noise ratio and contrast to noise ratio. So in fMRI, temporal signal to noise ratio is, in the most simplified, if you put a jar of oil in the scanner, it's what is the mean value across time in the voxel versus the standard deviation across time. So essentially, if you don't expect anything to change, because a jar of oil shouldn't be having like a build effect, ideally, then how much is it still fluctuating around the mean even then? So very often, I'm going to get into the piloted section next, but the first thing is you might put one of these jars of oils, we're called a phantom, into the scanner and say, what is my TSNR for these parameter checking? And you can compare different parameters and see how that varies. We can also measure TSNR in brains with the acknowledgement that some variation actually is what we care about and some isn't. So it's just, but it's still a valid measure. So if you put the same person in the scanner and scan them with two parameter sets and TSNR is bigger on one than the other, it's reasonable to assume that you're measuring something meaningful. And then contrast to noise is a little bit of a shift on TSNR. So instead of just saying, is my signal stable, it says I'm doing something where I expect to see an effect. So if you're doing a task, what is your task response magnitude versus the residual of the noise that doesn't fit your task magnitude? And, or if you're doing some sort of pattern matching, how well does it match the pattern versus not? So contrast to noise is a more flexible term, but it's a useful term when you have a scientific question. You can say, like, in this picture I have here, this was a study with music playing. And, you could say, do you hear, does this area respond to when you hear audio response? What is the effect magnitude versus the residual noise? So you can get a contrast noise for this region of interest. So like if I was piloting a study and I really cared about this severe focus area, I might say which options of data collection and processing and all that stuff gives me the highest contrast noise in my inferior corpus. And finally, head motion sensitivity. This is something that's both, acquisition parameters are going to affect how sensitive your skin is to head motion, also how you set up your whole protocol on how you fix people's heads. And some studies you might be able to say, like, I accept that people are going to move their head a little bit, or I'm scanning typically developing adult, just healthy volunteer adults who keep their head very still. I don't really care much about head motion because I can just remove it when I see it. Or you might be scanning a population of children or infants or fetuses where there's a lot of head motion, and then anything you can do with the acquisition stage to get rid of head motion is essential. Any questions on that so far? The other thing in acquisition parameters is there's a lot of things, like I said, you're going to copy, if you start by copying a program of someone else, there's been a lot of these things that are said. There's the TR, repetition time or sampling rate, which is how fast we collect every volume. There's a spatial resolution, so how big are our voxels? Are they 3 millimeters, 1 millimeter, something else? There's acceleration methods, which are in the last several lectures Peter and I talked about K-space, which is sort of the frequency profile, how the data is collected in sort of this frequency space. And what the acceleration methods are in various ways is you don't collect all the data that you should collect. You're not sampling the entirety of K-space. You're sampling some fraction of it, and then you're using, post-acquisition reconstruction methods to essentially reconstruct what you've lost in that process. And the thing to keep in mind there is the reason that's useful is because if it takes X amount of milliseconds to collect all of K-space. So if you collect half of K-space, it takes half as much time. So that's why it's useful. And for various reasons that are beyond the scope of this talk, the reconstruction methods can be quite good and accurate, but obviously with some compromises. There's things called like 2D versus 3D acquisitions. So I think in like when I was talking the other day, he was mostly talking about 2D acquisition, just like you excite a slice, and then you collect information on a slice, you excite another slice, you collect information on that slice. There's also multi-slice acquisition, which is you excite 2 slices at a time, two, 3, or 4 slices at a time, collect information, another 2, 3, or 4. I would still sort of specify that more as like a 2D acquisition method. But there's 3D acquisitions, which are you excite the entire volume of interest repeatedly and collect different areas in the 3D space each time. There's multi-echo fMRI. Come back Thursday in 2 days to hear my talk about multi-echo fMRI is. A lot of the stuff I talk about is bold contrast, so it's a T2 star contrast, but there's other contrasts that are blood volume sensitive or blood flow sensitive. And then there's parameters like flip angle, which I think someone was asking me when I talked the other day. The person is here, but they were sort of trying to get an explanation. It's sort of like when we talk about MRI in residence, like resonance is like someone going back and forth on a swing if you're pushing them at the right point. Flip angle is what angle are you getting the swing? You keep pushing them until the swing gets to a certain point. So think about like a 180 flip angle would mean you push them on the swing until they're going horizontal each direction. A 90-degree flip angle is you pushing them until you're sort of going back and forth with a 90-degree angle on the swing. And it seems like it's a very simple parameter, but it turns out that it's more complex than one thinks it can be. So again, if you've inherited a flip angle from somebody, ask someone, is this an appropriate flip angle for my study? So like I said, I'm not going to focus on all of those, but I'm going to focus on a couple. So the first thing I'm going to focus on is this repetition time TR or cycling rate. So why do we want to play with this parameter? So obviously, the shorter your TR, the faster your sample rate, the finer temporal resolution you get. So if you have an effect you want to see that might be happening every 1 second or less, that's really useful to get. If you want to better remove respiratory cardiac noise, you can take your TR all the way down to like under 400 milliseconds and just filter out your heart rate from that. And there's other artifacts that are easy to remove with a faster TR. And the other benefit of shorter TR is you get more volumes over time. So if you're collecting data for 5 minutes, with one TR, you might get 150 volumes, and all your stats are going to be on 150 data points. Or you could collect 300 volumes, and all your stats are on 300 data points. So those are all benefits. But there are also weaknesses of longer TR. So, as you shorten your TR, you're going to get more noise per volume. Some of the acceleration methods hit your noise, you add noise to your data. And also, as you shorten the TR, you also get changes in the fMRI steady state. So this is sort of a visualization of what I mean by steady state. In the other lecture, we talked about exciting protons. So when you excite the protons, the signal changes. And what we're measuring is essentially how much the signal, as it's from baseline, how much you're measuring. So, and this is based on the T1 relaxation time. So let's say in this case, I think I have a 90 millisecond to 2000 millisecond and 5 second TR. So the green one is the 5 second TR. The green one is the 5 second TR, and you can see that almost returns to baseline. So our signal volume change is almost the same as if it was DR, just collecting each volume independently. But if I go 2 second TR, it kind of starts to recover and then you drop it again, and then it starts to recover and you drop it again. And at 900 milliseconds, it's going up and dropping and going up. And this range from top to bottom affects your signal magnitude. So a short TR is hitting your signal quality that way. Possibly acceleration is hitting it. Acceleration methods sometimes also come with more artifacts. So you want to look at your results, your data to see, am I getting more artifacts with the parameters I chose? And if so, do I want to accelerate in a different way, or is it a compromise I don't want to make? And the other thing is you might get less brain coverage or larger voxels. So if you say I want to do a 900 millisecond TR, you might say, well, maybe I should do 3 million voxels instead of 2.5. Or maybe I don't need that cerebellum because I really want that 900 millisecond TR. So there's a bunch of factors considered in TR. I guess the other one I didn't even mention here is a lot of the fMRI signal is really this neurovascular coupling and hemodynamic response, which is relatively slow. So it turns out it takes maybe 5 seconds from neural activity to the peak of the hemodynamic response. It turns out we can temporarily resolve things much shorter than that. So if you have a study where you're trying to temporarily resolve things shorter than that, great. But if nothing in your study requires you to resolve things at much shorter temporal resolutions, then maybe that shorter TR isn't as critical. Yes?
So a question that I have, going back to Q&A concerns, or thoughts there. If the study requires, let's say, if you want a finer resolution, but you're concerned about the potential trade-offs, like sacrifice in sort of doing so, at what point would you just consider, what we just use to eat with the MRI and call it a day?
So the question is, as you're trying to figure out, temporal resolution versus spatial resolution or other things, at what point you just use the ET to call it? The answer is that's the standard question. Like it depends on your study, and for the MRI part alone, it's always going to be a compromise. That we could collect extremely fine spatial resolution with a slow sampling rate, or extremely fast temporal resolution with a really large voxels, or less coverage. And most of us can somewhere in the middle. We're sort of making some balance back and forth. Like for this study, I need 2 millimeter voxels or smaller, and for this study, I need a 1 second TR or faster. And then you say, okay, with those compromises, what do I do? And there's another study where those threshold points might be different. And the first EEG, I think there's another lecture on that later on, but I think the main thing with EEG is it's a different measure. So it's going to give you good temporal resolution, but designing an EGFR study where they actually, there's a lot of EGFR studies which are like, we call it fMRI, we call it EEG. Hey, look, they kind of look the same. But the ones that really benefit from it are the ones that say, hey, EEG information is genuinely enhancing what we see in the fMRI, or the fMRI is really enhancing what we see from the EEG. And so that goes back to the study design question. They really design a study that they really leverage each other.
Highly technical, but you can use like, let's say, joint ICA to like the infusion with EGF or myself.
I'm just repeating the thing. So you can do, the question was, you can use ICA to do like joint data fusion with EGFR. Yeah, there's tons of methods. But again, I would say it comes down to the scientific question, because there are some times where people do both methods and they're like, hey, we did them and we see something and isn't it pretty? But it's really how you design your studies. Like, okay, the way these combine together are informing us about some scientific or clinical question that we wouldn't otherwise know. So absolutely useful, but I think it comes down to the question and study design. So that was sort of an example with TR. Here's an example with other acquisition patterns. This is sort of going on that voxel size. So there was some studies, there's a bunch of studies happening at NIH about how small we can push that spatial resolution. And this gets back to what I was talking earlier about 2D versus 3D acquisitions. So if you look here, the top row is a 2D sequence. The bottom row is a 3D sequence. And this is TSNR for the same person's brain. What you could see is if we wanted to do 3 millimeter voxels, this is set, these two are set the same way. The 3D sequence gives you a much worse TSNR than the 2D sequence. You can sort of see this on the lower plot here as well. So this is TSNR of the two sequences. If you now drop down to 1.5 by 1.5 by 1.5 millimeter voxels, still the TSNR of the 2D sequence is better than the 3D sequence. If you drop down to sub-millimeter voxels, which is 0.75 by 0.75 by 1.5, now suddenly, because of the nature of how 3D acquisitions are done, your TSNR is actually better at 3D than 2D. So this is a parameter that, like, you know, it's actually a pretty substantial thing to like how we're collecting data to your sequences, but you're tweaking this other thing, your voxel size. And it, you know, you might say, hey, I got this from someone's data that for 2 millimeters voxels, and I'm going to, you know, now do much smaller voxels. And suddenly it turns out there's another option that would have been much better. So this is just sort of another way to think these parameters. I think with smaller voxels in general, like I wrote here, that the big advantage of small voxels is we're looking at the brain. We're never getting at the neural level, but the smaller we get, the more we're going to be measuring discrete elements of cortex, and at better spatial precision. But smaller voxels always means more noise, and it always means slower. So slower can be countered by acceleration, but it's always going to take more time. So you might say, I'm going to get smaller voxels and use more acceleration to get the same time, but it's to get the same total volume, it's always going to be slower. Any questions on that one? So if you remember from the beginning, I was going through different phases of the study. So first was design, then piloting. So you have your questions, you know what you want to do. Piloting is now you start collecting data and try to figure out, like, is my assumption of what I collect actually what I need to collect? Or, you know, I have several options to get to reach my goals, which one is best? So it is comparing the options for potential study size, collecting to make sure your decision work is expected. Make sure the acquisition workflow works with real people. So you might have a protocol design, which is like, yeah, we have 2 hours of scan time, we can collect this. And you get there and, you know, your test design is so complex, so boring, either too hard or too boring, that after 45 minutes, the person says, I'm done, or they fall asleep. So like, or they wiggle their head too much and you have to rethink about how that goes. Or you thought you collect this data in a block and it turns out that because of various let's say you're doing EEG, and EEG gets added, you thought it had 15 minutes to the setup, and it actually added 25 minutes to the setup. And some you don't have enough time to do the stuff in between. So actually piloting the scan and seeing where your workflow is essential. Decide how to log key information, store and process data. So piloting is a great place. You get your data, understanding what it is, how you're going to process it, sort of make your workflow so that when you start collecting data for real, it's you actually know you have your data that can be processed from collection through some sort of image as the result. As also when you start making your quality assurance workflow. So what are you going to look for when you collect every subject data? And making sure things work. So again, if there's any message that I'm going to stress again, do not use scanning parameters just because they worked for someone else. Easy here. Do not use scanning parameters just because they worked for someone else. And I think that's about 4 times I've said this before in my talk. This is an example of. So if you're not an expert in MRI physics, things you do not consider might affect data quality. I assume a lot of you have seen an MRI machine at some point. There's the bucket we stick their people's heads into. That's the receiver coil or head coil. Inside that coil, if you open it up, in a modern one for fMRI, you'll often see in some form a lot of loops of wire. Depending on the coil, they might be loops, they might be rectangles, they might have weird shapes. I picked this one because it has nice clean loops. So you can see like there's a row of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 loops here and 4 or 5 loops this way. This is the part that goes on top of the forehead. This is the part behind the head. When you hear someone say, I have a 32 channel head coil or a 64 channel head coil, these are the channels. So in the head coil, there's little coils of wire, each is independently collecting data and that are being collected. Now, why is this important? These coils are one things that define what acceleration is. So remember I said earlier with acceleration, you're collecting only part of your case space and reconstructing. The reason many acceleration methods work is because you collect a fraction of the data, but each of these little circles, these coils, is in a spatially different location. So you are essentially you're taking advantage of taking multiple different spatial measures of the same signal to reconstruct the data that's missing. So it's the equivalent of having multiple microphones around the room. If you like a microphone in a corner and one person is speaking, the volume each microphone receives might be able to tell you where I am standing in this room. So acceleration is the same thing. But how you accelerate depends on where these coils are. So generally, you need more coils in a dimension you're accelerating on than what you can do. So in this one, there's sort of 4 coils in this direction. So in this dimension, you can accelerate up to 4 times. It doesn't mean you should, it means it's possible. And here you can accelerate up to 2 times. So this is the 9-channel coil. Here could be a mock-up of another 9-channel coil, where it's 3 by 3. So you would never want to accelerate more than 3 in either dimension. So you could say, hey, I inherited the parameters. They use 9-channel head coil. I use a 9-channel head coil. Everything's the same. I can work. But if you don't know what your head coil looks like under the hood, literally under the hood, you would be using something that's just not going to work or going to give you really bad artifacts in your data. Yeah.
Let's say like spatial distribution patterns.
Yes, exactly. And this is something that, unless you know what's literally under the plastic, you're not going to know what it is. So this is an example of you really, if you're not an expert, you might not even think about stuff like this. It's just one example. But I'll also stress, if you are an MRI physics expert, I'm treating you by it. You already know to collect pilot scans, because you already know that you're always going to figure out something. There's an assumption you make that's wrong. So here is a pilot example from a recent study conducted by Catherine Walsh, who is, thank you very much for this. So she was doing a study on working memory using a pattern recognition method. I'm not going to go into all the details, but the first thing was, again, looking at this 2D versus the 3D acquisition. So collected in, essentially a TSNR map of 2D and 3D. And for the parameters she did, it turned out that 3D gave her better TSNR. Remember I said earlier that TSNR is a useful measure, but it's not everything. So various measures of contrast and noise are also useful. So in her specific, is the question? So the question is why the volumes different in 2D for 3D. That the answer is that these were essentially, this is the field of view collected, and each time they scanned, they ended up collecting a slightly different volume. I'm trying to remember if you were lining up to a specific area to hit both, or was just random.
We were just trying to catch the campus and the audience. It really cared. But we didn't really care. That fact, it was kind of dependent on how things and how that was in the scanner. And that day, it's slightly different because we read the different scenes because it's being in slide in these places. So that's that.
So the answer for the recording is it was slightly arbitrary. I think it campus in a few other areas, but the overall number of field of view was slightly bigger in the 3D, but mostly these two different campuses cited in arbitrary parameters. So the second figure was a measure of interest for the study. So can you use pattern recognition to decode the stimulus in the hippocampus? And this figure, this was multiple scans, multiple people, so it's a bit messy. It's not like a full study, but there were several questions that Catherine was trying to answer. Question one was this 2D versus 3D. Actually, so I'll first say that these figures, it's decoding accuracy versus chance. So 0 means that decoding accuracy was chance. Greater than 0 means you're doing better than chance. So the first question, the first question is the colors. Is what stimuli to use. So decoding faces, one set of runs, faces versus scenes. One did face in green is faces, scenes, objects, and in blue was a left versus right decoding in the hippocampus. And going in, there was some past work that said left versus right might actually decode better in the hippocampus than the blue one, but it turned out it did not for the existing study design. And it turned out that having faces, scenes, and objects gave better decoding of chance than just faces and scenes. And again, like we said, we saw better TSNR for 3D, but even when you're looking at that hippocampus in 3D, we're also seeing slightly better decoding accuracy there. So this is just one example. There's more piloting done. So this wasn't like the only decision factor, but an example of how you use piloting to say, okay, here are things we weren't sure about designing our study. We kind of have the overall goal, what can we, can we decode different object categories in the hippocampus? But what categories are going to give us the most robust findings? So this is, I think, a good example of piloting. So the next step after piloting I have is data collection protocol. So how do you actually plan your study? Checklists and workflows are your friends, both for regulation, safety, and experimental needs. If you don't have some sort of checklist, you're going to forget something, and hopefully it's not something that's going to cause, safety or ethical, safety or other issues down the road. So checklists written down are essential. Then I make a protocol what to save. So obviously you want to save your MRI data. That's going to, the scanners here, that's going to be automatic. But task behavioral logs, what do you want to log from your task if you don't have that? Respiration and cardiac, like I said earlier, I'm going to keep hammering that on, collect respiration and cardiac and save it. Acquisition timing. So, how many minutes between your scans, were there any issues in between? And anything atypical. So this is a big ugly log from one of my scans from a little while back. So as the person was talking, I had my protocol, but I wanted to collect. And I actually cut out a bunch of the normal stuff here. It's like scan 7, fine. I didn't copy it just because I just put it enough already. But things I wrote down along the way. The important thing for writing down is these are the things that might not automatically save somewhere else, and you're going to forget, or you're going to share with the data with someone who can divide the wisdom. So the volunteer had a lot of hair on top of their head, and I wrote down, hey, the top of their head maybe 1 to 2 centimeters lower than others, and that means it's further from the receiver coil, which means the signal quality is going to be different. I said, were looking, there was something weird about their gyri that I was a gyrus I was interested in. Yeah, I think it was just the slice angle, but I said worth double checking and processing later. Um, there was audio in the test and processing, and the speaker was really low, so volume was low in the first scan, and I raised it, and the noise cancellation was breaking up, and I had to cancel a scan. So there was like a 7 minute gaps of where I canceled the scan and had to restart something, which isn't true in the other study scans. And then there was other troubles along the way. So all this is logged here. And it turns out I processed these data. They looked fine. The results looked fine. Maps looked what I expected. But I logged all this stuff and I saved all this stuff because it might be of relevance later. And if you don't write this down and document it and share it, it's gone. This is the type of information that will disappear. In general, for the protocol, organize data in ways that will support future sharing. As much as you have a consistent structure, information, the data scan those results. And as far as workflows and code, there's a lot of people out there that are like saying, you should be able to run, press the button and run your data begin to end. I think that is lovely. If you can do it, more power to you. But I think it's an unrealistic bar for most mortals. The level of code quality and sharing I think is useful is document your workflow, document your code that your future self will understand, because your future self is going to forget things. And if you can make it at least someone says 5 years from now, hey, what did you do? And you have enough documentation that you didn't tell them what you did. I think that is, if you can get that level, and that's hard, that is phenomenal to get that level. And then again, I'm hitting the quality assurance hammer. But to have quality assurance protocol to run during and soon after your scan. Did they do the behavioral as expected? Data quality looks. I have a paper that I'll be talking about 28th lecture. So that's sort of things to think about for the collection protocol. Now we're finally data collection. If you did everything right so far, you're following a script. You know what you're collecting, you have good. You're following a script and think that data collection to be smooth. Then of course you will go off script. So like I showed you in that last lecture, the important thing is when you go off script, log when you go off that script. That also, how you get script also tells you what you have to document. And then decide if the script will change. So like I said in the example of EEG fMRI, if your script was the first 15 minutes to get the EEG cap on the person, and every scan is taking and a lot of scans taking 25 minutes, then you might say, okay, I have to change something to fit everything in. And do quality assurance after each acquisition. There's things you can check later, but do at least that first round of checks of data as soon as possible after the scan, or at minimum before you collect any more data. There's enough horror stories I've heard here and elsewhere where someone collected a massive data set and then realized that the region of interest, the entire point of the study, they were getting lousy data in a non-trivial percentage of their volunteers. And if they had noticed that earlier, they would have saved hours upon hours of time, money, etc. I call one person out on this, but the truth is this happens way too often, and there's no reason to shame any on this. And again, the main message from quality assurance is all data sets have problems. If you're not checking, you might be missing something. If you're checking, you're going to have fewer unknown problems. There'll still be problems, but fewer than unknown. So I'm going to go through, like I said, my talk in a few weeks is going to be specific to quality checks, but this is sort of just a very quick run through of quality check you can do with these tools. There's also a NAFTA lecture in a few weeks as well. Pretty quickly after a scan notes. You have your unprocessed data. Over here, this is dropout. You don't have a big hole in front of your eyes. So how big is that dropout area? Are you comfortable with it? How much do you care about those areas? More dropout here. You're often going to see sort of a brightness at the edge of the brain with modern head coils. Do you see obvious artifacts? You have alignment in your anatomical. So when you line them up, do they line up? That also helps see if there's any significant distortion. What areas do you have dropout? So in this subject, here's the area, these are the dropout areas versus the brain. Do I really care about this part of the brainstem? Do I really care about this area of orbital cortex? If the answer is no, great. If the answer is those are central to my study, then that's a huge problem. You can look at head motion. How much do they move their head across time? You can look at what voxels were removed by head motion or other sensoring tools versus your task design when events appear. And finally, you can look at the cystic map to say, like, did I get activation in the areas I expected? And if not, that's something to think about more. So next phase after the question is analysis and interpretation. My general advice is whenever you write a script, make sure they fail in clear ways. You don't want a script to fail in a way that, like, you pull the wrong subject and you notice it. Like if it crashes, you want the script to crash. You don't want it to sort of keep running when something got skipped. Save intermediate data. That's also a good way to check when things fail or understand what happened. Look at your data. I wish this was obvious, but there's a lot of pipelines out there that that you go from running a script to your final figures without looking at anything in between, and that's how things get missed. That's how you don't notice. Like, hey, I'm getting weak activity in this area. You're getting no activity in the area. You don't have data in that area. Back provenance, how data were created. I know I'm getting near the hour, so a couple slides left. I got 5 slides left, so I'll see how quickly I can go, and then I can stay a little bit longer for questions. I was realizing, like, looking at the talks, no one's actually talking about like task fMRI and connectivity fMRI as like standalone lectures. So just to make sure I'm not talking way above people, this is a task design where I had each of these is sort of when events happen. There was visual events, audio events, visual word stimuli, audio word stimuli. So each of these are the timings of when it happens. If I'm fitting this model to all times in the brain, and these are the voxels that are activating, that are significantly active to some combination of these. And this is what it kind of looks like. So this little crosshair here. If black line is the data at single voxel, the red line is these model lines fit to the data. So this is supposed to sort of explain the task and also a quality check. This is I'm seeing a language task, it's an audio task. I'm seeing a lot of those areas active. And it models the data well. But in this task specifically, I was interested in things like, what is word stimulus versus non-word stimuli look like? So you can actually use these to make a contrast to see areas that are more selective to words than non-words. And that's what this is here. With analysis interpretation, one take-home message I want to give is non-significant does not mean meaningless. So there was a study that got a good bit of press a few years ago, which essentially published the exact same data set with 70 different groups processed the exact same data set. And the actual paper was pretty nuanced, but there was a few lines in it, a few things saying each pipeline gave very different results, and this is of high concern. And there's a bunch of big articles saying, well, that's terrible because everyone gets different results in the data. This is the significance data from 25 of the top left corner of their bigger figure of 25 subjects. And if you look at this, these are the areas that are of significance in a bunch of different processing methods. So you have areas that are usually significant, areas that are not significant, big blobs that appear and disappear, and all this stuff. So if you look at this, you're like, oh my God, what's wrong with that? Different groups say they're doing the exact same processing and they have different results. What's going on? But if you take that exact same thing and you still show what's significant, there's lines around the significant areas, but you just sort of do a translucent threshold for everything else. So it kind of fades from like opaque in the significant areas to translucent everywhere else. What you could see is the maps are extraordinarily similar. And the big thing different in most of these is where they, what their final effect raw magnitudes were versus their significance thresholds. So you make your threshold a little bit higher, a little bit lower, and areas pop in and out. The actual spatial pattern of the result is extremely similar. This is the top corner of this thing that I'm showing here. And you can see for the vast majority of them, the correlation maps of just what these spatial patterns look like are insanely close to 1. So the actual patterns were really similar, and the big difference really came down to this threshold. Yes, question?
Yeah, it's multiple comparison correct?
So yes, so the question is multiple comparisons. So each of these separate analyses, they chose their own method for multiple comparisons questions. So like some of them might have been done the same way, some of them might be different. But the trouble is multiple comparisons correction is like if you have 10,000 voxels, you're doing 10,000 tests, you have some way to correct for multiple comparisons. And there is no ground truth. So your threshold is arbitrary, how you define commonality is arbitrary. So these things are always going to vary. So it depends how you visualize data and interpret it. So I think the key message here is not significant is not meaningless. And this translucent thresholding is something I never recommend. And just to hammer this point home, there's a study of data a few years ago where we had 3 amazing volunteers who saw the same block design session checkable task for 9 hours. So they did across 9 days, 9 sessions. So like every session was like an hour to an hour and 15 minutes of watching, 5-minute runs of watching a flashing checkerboard. And when you show a flashing checkerboard, we get primary visual cortex response, we get LGN response, we get some other stuff. But the question is, what else happens as you just get better data? It turns out, so if you collect 5 runs, this is 25 minutes of data. This is what is significant to a flashing checkerboard. If you do 40 runs of data, this is what's significant to a flashing checkerboard. If you do 65 runs of data, this is what's significant. If you do 100 runs or 9 hours of data, the entire brain is significant to a flashing checkerboard task. And you can look in the paper sort of showed like response shapes, the magnitude, like they're really small responses. So like in visual cortex, it's like a 4% signal change. You look at some of these other areas and it's like a 0.1% signal change, but significant when you have enough data. So this really highlights that how we set our thresholds is quasi-arbitrary, and how much data we collect is also a factor. So if you put too much significance, we need a significant thresholds in some form. We have to say what's meaningful or not. But if you put too much weight on this threshold, you're kind of missing the forest for the trees. So this is sort of my word of caution on that. I just sort of very quickly, another example with connectivity. So connectivity is unlike tasks, you're looking at time series. I chose the same data set, same target voxel is this red time series. And I said, what correlates with that? And here's another voxel over here that correlates with that. So these are 2 time series. You can see, if you look at them, you can see many of the peaks and troughs and the principal places that correlates. This is when people are talking about functional connectivity, there are other methods, but very often what they're just talking about is correlating time series like this. And as an example of the sort of thing to keep in mind with these analyses is elegant results do not mean correct results. So this is a lovely study from a while back where they were doing these resting state functional connectivity results across aging. And they were showing that as people got older, these different networks were sort of developed, became sort of more local and distributed networks. The trouble is these data were reanalyzed a few years later. And it turned out that you believe that kids move more in this area than adults. And if you remove the high motion volumes, then for the kids, for everyone, the kids looked a lot more similar results. So this big effect change was being heavily driven by not removing motion censoring. So this is the paper that sort of created the current, the current approach of aggressive censoring of motion and data. And I love this quote from one of the senior authors. This really sucks. My favorite results was our, and I love this quote. Both because if you know Steve Peterson, you can hear this coming out of his voice, but also because it's a good science. This is good science. Is you publish something, you realize you made a mistake, you publish and own it, and that is we can say like, hey, you got it wrong, but no, this is what science should be. You realize something you didn't realize when you first published, and you own it, and that's awesome. But the message to sort of take home in general from this is that anything that affects correlation, because as I said, this is just correlation of time series, will affect results. So neural fluctuations, that's what we want to see, but also respiratory fluctuations, head motion, scanner artifacts, all this stuff will affect correlation. So if you're doing anything in functional activity, understanding what you're keeping and rejecting is essential. In that last section of communication, I just have a slide or two on this. I can go on forever, but like, I think this is a great fine. Just it's easy to share code and data if it's set up with sharing in mind. I stressed that earlier. I have been on both sides of this where I get near the end of a project. I was like, okay, how the heck do I share what I just collected? That is not a fun place to be. The more you're thinking about this the whole way, the happier you'll be when it's time to share your results and publish. And that same line I wrote earlier, write code that you can share with your future self. And if you share data, this is really not done, and it really upsets me. Share your quality assessment measures, because if you've done QA on your data and you know what's good and bad, and you don't share it, you're just leaving that as a nice surprise for someone else to discover. The more you share, the more people are gonna do interesting and useful stuff with your data. And final slide, take home messages. You really like there are choices at every step. I think if there's any message that there's a lot of choices you can make, think through about what you're making choices and why. Quality assessment is critical at every phase. But just generally, no one is an expert in every step of the neuroimaging study. You've gotten the physics lectures before mine, but to do a good fMRI study, in some level, you're going to be hitting behavioral psychology, clinical medicine, anatomy, physics, stats, software development, communication. None of us are a genuine expert in all of these. Some of us have gotten, passively good at all of these and have strengths in some of them, but none of us are an expert in all of these. So if there's any message to take home, learning what you know and don't know is almost more important, and knowing how to ask is almost more important than what you do know. That's it. So thank you very much. Any questions?
Well, you made a couple things about how basically anything that can affect this correlation can actually affect the course down to the result. So in accounting for that, trying to do the best science that you can, how would you address spurious correlation? Would you think about regret, covariance, ways of accounting?
So the question is for correlation, how do you essentially identify correlation with no interest of noise things and things of interest? That is a whole other lecture. I actually gave it here a couple of years ago. So look at the recordings. I have a few lectures on what is signal, what's noise, and medicine state, which cover that a lot. But the short answer is all of the above. There are a regression method that handles some of this. Some of it is just looking at data and knowing what you can use and what you can't use. Multi-echo, which is my topic for next lecture on Thursday, is one tool that can potentially help remove some of these noise sources, some signal sources. But even with like regression, what do you regress? So people regress out head motion. Is the raw head motion trace what you want to regress out? Is it the first derivative? Some people regress out the first derivative and the second derivative head motion, at which point you actually remove all your degrees of freedom. So for respiration, you remove the pulsation rate, you remove the breathing depth. Is there a breathing depth with lag? So that these are active areas of research. And there are papers that have used all these methods and shown benefits, but I would say doing nothing is the wrong answer. But there is no one method where I would say this is the right method for every study, or even this is the perfect method. Questions? Okay. Thank you, everyone.